Welcome to Conversations with Creative Minds. We have been searching for the meaning of creativity and the role it plays in our daily life. People use creativity to express themselves in different ways, such as writing, painting, poetry, composing music, or innovating new products. Creative minds have never been more relevant than today because of the need to solve our society's dynamic and complex problems. William Martin is an American author of historical novels. He started his career as a historical research assistant and directed theater. After graduating from Harvard University, he worked in construction to raise money to go to a film school in California to work in Hollywood. While in Hollywood, he discovered his real passion, bringing American history to life. Mr. Martin is the New York Times bestselling author of 11 novels, including Back Bay, Nerve Endings, The Lincoln Letter, City of Dreams, Citizen Washington, Bound for Gold, The Rising of the Moon, Annapolis, The Lost Constitution, Cape Cod, and Harvard Yard. Currently, he is working on a new novel called December 41.
When I figure that out, I'll stop writing books. I think that one of the truths about what I do in my career is that it's the same thing that I used to do when I was about 8 years old. As an only child, I would go up into the attic as a kid and invent stories and playmates and draw pictures in sketchbooks and on long rolls of paper that were always pictures of battles and military actions and things like that. And at some point along the way, that morphed into me coming up here onto the third floor of this house, where I've written 11 of my 12 books across a span now of about 40 years, where here I have written about battles and made up imaginary characters and put them in action in relationship to historical characters. And I think tried to show those people who read my books the adventure of history. Even though most of it has been lived for me right here in this room. In between, I've managed to get out and travel and go on ships and submarines and wander battlefields and do a lot of other interesting research stuff. But mostly I am just a guy that likes to fill his head with interesting facts and always be thinking, wherever I go, of what the story is here. How did it get to be what it is? Whether we're talking about wandering in the woods of eastern Massachusetts or traveling to France. How did we get to this place at this moment in time? And that's really what my books are about. Well, Harvard is one of those places where you get out of it what you put into it, and that's the real lesson that I learned at Harvard. And I, of course, eventually would write a novel about the history of Harvard and about the way in which it impacts dozens of lives across a long span of time. That book is called Harvard Yard. But the big idea is that at Harvard, you decide what your passion is, and then you try to justify it intellectually in some way. Whether your passion is going to be to go to medical school or study math, or in my case, tell stories. And that's how they build classes at Harvard, is to collect lots of people with lots of interesting and diverse opinions and attitudes and pursuits and passions, put them all together so that they'll all learn from one another and become well-rounded individuals. Can't say that I learned a lot about physics or science when I was at Harvard, but I sure learned about literature and writing and storytelling. And my passions were nurtured not only in the classrooms, but also as a theatrical director, which is what I was for almost every semester I was there. I directed a play. And those things were very educational to me about storytelling and audiences and all of the other things that you need to know, whether you're writing fiction, nonfiction, directing plays, directing movies. And originally I wanted to direct movies. So Harvard was only the first step. Actually, it was you could say the second or third step in my education, because I started at the Robert Gould Shaw School in West Roxbury from K through 8, and then went to Catholic Memorial High School, where I had some very good teachers, very good English teachers particularly, and then on from there to Harvard. And then after a year and a half or 2 years in the Boston construction business, which is an education too, and lots of things that I learned from balancing myself two stories above the street, managed to find their way into my novels. Then I went on to the USC Film School, where I studied to be a movie director. When I went to the USC Film School, I wanted to be a movie director, just like most of the other people who I first met at the USC Film School. Everybody wanted to direct. That was the old joke. We all want to direct, and we all have screenplays, and those are the things that we want to direct. And that's because we came from places where we were firing our own imaginations by seeing the movies, the kinds of movies that we would want to make. And ultimately, it became the kinds of books that I would want to write. These books behind me, that's my rule of thumb when I sit down to write, is what kind of book would I like to read? What kind of movie would I like to see? And I was influenced by many movie directors. Initially, David Lean, who made Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. Those movies, those big movies, big stories on broad canvases is what I like to call them, about characters who appear to be larger than life, but are just ultimately just as flawed and uncertain about the grand world that they inhabit as all of the rest of us are. And I think that's a fairly good description of what Lawrence of Arabia is all about. And then later I fell in love with the films of John Ford, the great movie director who worked through the 30s to the 60s, actually longer than that, making movies about all kinds of topics, but primarily about American history, the great Westerns that he made with John Wayne, which are always about more than they appear to be, stories that may be grand adventures, and yet they're telling you more about who we are. And then, of course, I also love the films of Alfred Hitchcock, and still do, because there was such an awareness in the Hitchcock films of what pure cinema is really about, of every shot having a particular meaning, and every angle having a particular emotion. So you could learn an enormous amount from Hitchcock too. You could learn from all of them. And when I went to film school, I found lots of people who were as fascinated and passionate about these things as I was. And so it was a good place to be if you loved movies. And we were in one of the early waves of film students. Today, kids everywhere want to go to college and go and study movies. Well, in those days, back in the mid 1970s, it was a pursuit that was looked upon with a little bit more uncertainty, you could say, on the part of, well, parents and in-laws who might wonder, what the heck is he going to do with a degree from film school? And that question did on occasion get asked of me, but I think I answered pretty well, because what I figured out while I was there was that the quickest way into the movie business was to write a good screenplay, not to make a 9-minute sync sound movie about whatever the subject happened to be, but to write a screenplay that a producer could look at and say, this guy knows how to write a 120-page screenplay, and it's a story, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, character, plot, momentum, and all of the other things that matter. And so that's why I started writing screenplays. Nobody wanted to produce my screenplays, but the first novel that I decided to write, at the behest of one of these movie producers, whom I went to meet in order to pitch on my writing, she said, the way you write, you ought to write a novel. And I took her up on it. And here I am today. The thing you have to understand about every novel, every good story, is that your first allegiance is to the tale itself. Never let the facts get in the way of a good story is one of the rules that I live by. Of course, the other rule is that the facts always provide some of the best material. That helps me. That's why I study history. That's why I begin from historical conceits and concepts. This book just over my shoulder here, City of Dreams, is a novel about the hunt for the 220-year hunt for a box of bonds that represent the unretired debt of the American Revolution. And those bonds actually exist. But what I do in order to create an interesting story out of it all, that's where that's where the invention comes in. That's where the imagination comes in. You always have to be asking yourself hard questions as a storyteller about, is this story moving fast? Does it have momentum? Does it have drama, suspense, and so forth? And some of the ability to do that is learned, and some of it is entirely innate. And when you ask, for example, where imagination comes from or how I fire my imagination, I can tell you that I'm sitting here reading interesting books, works of history about some period that I might like to write about, because all of these books, once I decide the period I want to go into and so forth, all of them require me to start doing historical research. But no matter what I choose to write, I always have the third eye that's looking down the street and around the corner to see what's this going to be like as a story? What will the characters be like that I'm now going to create? And that's, that question always is in my head. And I know that one of the gifts that I have, that not everyone who sits down to do this has, is the gift of imagination. of being able to, just as I've been from the time that I was a kid, of being able to imagine people into existence and put them into these difficult situations. Well, I've always believed that we should try to learn from the past, but not allow it to control us, because there are pluses and minuses to that whole process. It's nice to learn that that slavery was bad, but it's important not to spend. Well, let me rephrase that. Learning from history is what we all do in our lives. Whatever decision we're about to make, whether it's to buy a particular car or to travel to a particular place, we always think about how some past experience has influenced us. Why I want to go to Italy because I've loved reading about Italy in the past, or I want to buy a certain car because I have a good history with those cars. I think that for every person, there is a personal history that influences the way that they think, and there is a larger, grander national and cultural history that also influences the way they think and what they do and how they act. And when I sit down to write a novel, I try to give you the historical character living in that moment in time. I don't try to give you, even though it's inevitable that this happens, I don't try to create modern characters and drop them down into the history so that suddenly we can say, yeah, if I was back in history, I would act like that guy. No, what I try to do is give you history before it becomes history, when it's still drama, when the people who are confronting the difficult decisions that were made in 1776 or in 1941 or in 1861, talking about American history, those people felt in some ways the way that we may feel in the 21st century, that they're living one of the most challenging moments in time and history. And once you've implanted that belief in them, you're able to bring them to life and bring their dilemma to life for the modern reader who wants to know, how did they deal with their dilemma? And what can I learn about whatever that problem was in order to see into the future? You can't really say that every incident in history has some exact, or every incident today has some exact analog back in history. But you can draw parallels. You can show people acting through tremendous crises at any moment in time. And the life of George Washington and the life of Lincoln are both about responding to tremendous crisis and trying to do the right thing. And that's the biggest lesson that you can draw from history, I think. But always remember that when you read history versus historical fiction, historical fiction is still, it's storytelling. It's it may not be in service of the truth, but I always say it's in service to a larger truth. I can't remember who it was who said that history tells you what happened, historical fiction tells you what it felt like. I'm trying to give you the experience of living in history, of being, in the case of the novel Cape Cod, right behind my head, of being aboard the Mayflower. When those people arrive, driven as they are by deep religious convictions and the desire to create a whole new world for themselves, and they arrive at this cold New England coast in November, and the wind is blowing, and it's gray, and it's dark early in the afternoon, and there's no place for them to pull in and drop anchor and get out and have a nice hot meal. They are the only people there, to their knowledge, of course. There are the Wampanoags that are going to get involved with them in that first and second generation, particularly, and their story is in that book as well. But I give you that sense of what it felt like to those pilgrims to arrive, and then you also remember the old adage that you never let the facts get in the way of a good story, and then you tell the story. It would be very difficult to step out of the story itself and keep stopping and saying to you, oh, this part really happened. That part I'm not sure about. This part I made up. What you need to do is trust the teller of the tale here, and trust the tale itself. Some authors have absolutely no respect for history except as a place to put clothing onto characters and give them a setting. Other authors are studious, fastidious about the story that they're telling you, and other authors want you to know that they respect the history that they're telling, if not the letter of it, then the spirit of it. Now, a perfect example of this is my novel, Citizen Washington. George Washington, in that novel, his life is told by 12 different narrators, each of whom tells his own story as the story of Washington's life is unfolding. The idea behind this, of course, is that for all of us who relate stories of other people and other places, there is a component of ourselves in that story. And so the Mount Vernon slave tells his part of it, John Adams tells his part of it, and Alexander Hamilton pops in as well. And in each of these instances, they don't say anything that they wouldn't say, at least to my mind, based upon my reading of history. And I always try to draw the quotes, the exact quotes that they have offered us about Washington out of the history and put them into the novel. And while George Washington may say things that I've just made up, I try to be true to the spirit of what Washington said and why he said it. And that requires me to read a lot of history and ingest a lot of primary source material, Washington's letters and so forth, and then find ways to get it back to the reader in a believable and dramatic form. I once reviewed another novel about George Washington in the Boston Globe, a novel that was fairly well reviewed, in which George Washington appears as a major character. And during the novel, he falls in love. During the siege of New York, he falls in love with one of the prostitutes who ran the houses of ill fame, which were down there right next to St. Paul's Chapel on Vesey Street, where later the World Trade Center would rise. And After the Americans have been chased out of New York, Washington dresses up in disguise and sneaks back into New York to spend time with her. George Washington would never do something like that. And I pointed it out in the review. But what I also said was, if you are looking for a certain kind of novel, a kind of comic novel, the book was called Johnny One-Eye. If you're looking for a certain kind of comic novel that plays with history in ways that I would never play with it, then this might be a book for you. What I didn't say, of course, was my book is better, because that's not why I was reviewing this particular book. But that gives you an idea of the spectrum across which historical fiction can work, from complete invention and from an author who sees history as nothing but just an instrument for his own ideas and his entertainment as an author of, say, something comic like that book, versus somebody like me who's out to entertain you, but also is respectful of the history. So you need to pick this up just by the way that you read the book. And there are some wonderful books that are about history that don't really necessarily respect the history the way I do. Gore Vidal once said, "Those who get their history from historical fiction get the history they deserve." And that's something that you should keep in the back of your mind whenever you write, whenever you, as a reader, sit down and start wondering, well, did this really happen? Did that really happen? And I always love hearing from readers who say, "I enjoyed your book, and you kept sending me back to the internet or to a history book to find out if that happened or that happened." And even if they discovered that particular events in my novels didn't really happen, it means that I have engaged them in a way that has made them want to know more. And that's one of the things that a good novelist should do, is to make you want to know more, either about the events or the setting or the characters themselves. I think we're always a product of the past that has been created by the most personal decisions of our ancestors, whether it is of, say, my ancestors to come here because the potatoes had gone bad in Ireland in the 1840s, or the decision of, say, my father to take a job at a particular place where he met my mother. Those kinds of decisions influence us in history. And so too do the decisions that were made 200 years ago. And those decisions emerged from an enormous span of human culture that begins with or so they tell us in the history books, with the Magna Carta and the efforts of the English to rule themselves rather than be ruled by a king, to the political culture, the economic culture, and all of those things are influenced, particularly for Americans, by the sense that we have, no matter where we settle in the 18th and 19th centuries, of limitless possibilities. We can always just go over the next hill because there is always a frontier. And when I talk about the impact of place on us, I'm talking about all of these strands of culture and economy and history that have been traveling to us from Europe, mostly from other cultures as well, all of them coming into the places where we live, whether it's Boston or New York or Washington or San Francisco or Los Angeles, the main cities that I have written novels about, or Annapolis behind me, or Cape Cod. All of these places have their own cultures, and each of them will influence the characters who live there. Sometimes it's in subtle ways, sometimes it's in much more significant ways, but at the bottom of it, the fundamental truth is that whether we're talking about the pilgrims on that ship, or whether we're talking about the people who get trapped in that building, and I do have a scene on 9/11, who get trapped in that building on 9/11, whether we're talking about either of those people or any group of people in between, there are certain fundamental human emotions that are always the same. Times and places may change, but people and their instincts and their desires, their human nature is always the same. And what I really try to do is show you, well, I like to, as I take you to places where the foreign seems familiar and the familiar seems unique. When you're aboard a ship like the Mayflower, you are in to a modern 21st century person being on an ancient leaky caravel, which is one of the terms that they use to describe that ship with the big poop deck. To be on an ancient ship like that, on an empty coastline of New England, that's a foreign place. But there are people aboard that ship that are very similar to us in very many ways, and it's that's making the foreign seem familiar. And within each of those characters that I create, and this pertains in any period that you write about, when I introduce each of those characters, I give them each human characteristics, whether they are rebellious or conventional in their thinking, whether they are big dreamers or people that just want to put their heads down and work. I take familiar characteristics and make those characteristics in some way seem unique by embodying them in an interesting human being. And that's what I mean when I say make the foreign seem familiar and the familiar seem unique. And to try to give you a larger answer that encompasses place and culture and politics and history and so forth isn't really as descriptive or as evocative as those two ideas when I talk about what I'm really trying to do, in addition to entertaining you and keeping you up late at night, because I've given you a really good story in which you are saying from one page to the next, what is going to happen next? What would I be doing in the situation in which those characters suddenly find themselves? Well, it depends on where you are in the 18th century. If you're in Boston in the 18th century, there is a powerful influence of the church that has lasted from the day that the Pilgrims first landed. And that culture says that you go to church on Sundays and you can't have plays and theater. There is no theater in Boston, no legal theater until about 1780. And, public performances of other kinds are okay. It's a strict and controlling culture. The culture of, say, New York City is quite different. New York's birth has come from the Dutch at first, who are generally more open-minded, and there's a more open-minded and opportunity-based culture in New York City, where you can take advantage of the chance to rise. Boston was much more stratified. If you began on a particular social level, that's where you were probably going to stay throughout your life. If your father was a blacksmith, you were going to be a blacksmith. If your father was a barrister, you would be a barrister, et cetera, et cetera. So within the whole of the United States, there were different kinds of cultural lives from one place to the next, and different kinds of economic lives too. I mean, New England was seafaring. The South was agriculture based upon slavery. And all of these things would ultimately clash, not only in the Civil War later on, they would clash in the construction of and the building of the Constitution. So it's a very complicated kind of question that you're asking, and very difficult to answer, I would say. Well, it was an idea that was evolving from the time that the Pilgrims first got off the boat. They came here to get away from the king and his church, the Church of England, which they felt was as corrupt as the Catholic Church, and they all considered that to be corrupt. Whether it was or not is a different question, but that's what motivated the Pilgrims. That's what motivated the birth of Congregationalism, basically across New England, was the sense that everybody should be in control of their own destiny within their own little parish. I'm not talking about predetermination and some of the other aspects of Calvinism that feed into that religion. But what I'm saying is that from the beginning, New Englanders who arrived here in this very cold and very challenging climate, these New Englanders had to be very self-reliant. And once people in many different parts of the 13 colonies all began to think in the same direction about the same thing, and it didn't all just emerge from one mind. It didn't all just happen with George Washington thinking about it, or John Adams, or John Hancock, or any of the others. It began as a kind of large, it was a multi-fronted historical movement in which Americans in many different parts of the country were beginning to think, as Thomas Paine would write in Common Sense, that it was foolhardy to expect a society of active, productive, and economically committed people. I mean, committed to building a strong economy. And don't forget, the people of the middle class of the 13 colonies in the 18th century probably lived better lives in many ways than the so-called middle class. That's not the term they would have used at the time, who lived in England. You know, that's why so many of the British couldn't quite understand why Americans were feeling so rebellious. But people heeded and had been thinking in advance of what Thomas Paine would ultimately say. It is foolhardy to expect a society like ours to, whenever they wish to redress a grievance, send a letter that takes 6 or 8 weeks to get to England, wait for a response, and wait for that response to come 6 or 8 weeks or even longer back across the Atlantic. It is foolhardy. People wanted self-determination. But at the beginning, all of them, in the first year, 1775, they were ready to do this in a way that didn't break away from Great Britain, even though Thomas Paine, in his writings, was urging it from the beginning. Don't forget the first American flag is 13 stars and 13 stripes, red and white, and up in the corner, the canton, as it's called, the Union Jack. It's called the Grand Union flag, and it's supposed to express our willingness to maintain a good relationship with, as they called him, the best of kings. On January 1st, 1776, right in Prospect Hill in Somerville, George Washington leads a detachment from Cambridge to Prospect Hill and raises that flag so that the British can see it. At the time, everything is kind of up in the air because Congress has sent to England something called the Olive Branch Petition, asking the best of kings, going over the head of Parliament to the king, asking him to intervene on behalf of the colonies so that this taxation issue that is so vexing to us can be adjusted and confronted in an honorable way. And if you do that, Your Majesty, we will maintain our status as good English subjects. Of course, the king basically says to them, I'm going to hire Hessian mercenaries and I will grind your heads in the dust. And at that point, the American flag changes from 13 stripes with the canton of the Union Jack to 13 stripes and 13 stars up in the corner, because it is right around then in January of 1776 that Americans north to south begin to recognize, and Washington's been coming to it for longer than most people. They begin to recognize that we may need to break away entirely here. This British mercantile system that we have been caught under, and this gets around to your economic question, a system which had said that Americans could be as productive as they wanted to be, but in all of their business dealings, all of their economic dealings, they could only buy and sell with Britain. This system has been unfair to us. This has brought us to rebellion, and now the king is being unfair to us as well, and now it's time to rebel. And by 6 months after Washington has raised the flag on Prospect Hill in Somerville, 6 months after that, you have the Declaration of Independence. And then it's a war for real. And the men from all 13 states at that point rather than colonies, write in the Declaration, pledge, as it's written, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to this new cause, to the creation of this new country, where they will create a government that will be just for everyone. Of course, we're still working on that part of it. Paine is interesting. He's an interesting character, and he's very, very accessible as a writer. Jefferson was a wonderful writer. John Adams knew how to write a legal brief. Benjamin Franklin could write a good letter. George Washington could be a little bit obtuse in some of his writing style, but he knew when to say things firmly and directly. So I wouldn't say I have any particular favorite among them. And then, of course, Alexander Hamilton, who's now a big cultural hero, was someone who learned how to write in George Washington's voice so that he could write George Washington's letters for him during the Revolution. The written word was very important to all of them because, of course, they didn't have a lot of other ways of communication. There was no telephones, and smoke signals were a little bit difficult to make work in the rain. So I think that there's something to be learned from a lot of different writers in the 18th century. But Paine lives on because he said so much that was either very poetic, such as "These are the times that try men's souls," the sunshine, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. Well, I can't remember the rest of it. Forgive me. But he wrote well, and his ideas were pertinent then and later. He was a very strong opponent of the king and of royalty in general. And in that way, he was a modern thinker. And yet, so were Adams and Jefferson. And they had serious philosophical considerations about how this country should proceed from where it was to what it is still trying to become. Well, I think that it's not so much the presidency, although that's truly hugely significant, where Washington holds the country together. But during the Revolution itself, from 1775 to 1783, I would say that during that time, you can take almost anybody in the arch of American independence, pull him out, and the structure will hold. But Washington is the keystone, mostly because they come to respect him as a result of his generalship in the Revolution. And that respect for Washington is an important part of the respect that they all have for the process during the Constitutional Convention. And when they decide on a president as being a necessity, they are very fearful that this is the kind of thing where we're setting up another potential king. The last thing we want is a king. But as Franklin says at the Constitutional Convention, once they have figured out the mechanisms of this government in the broadest sense, and they have a sense of who the president is going to be, Jefferson or Franklin looks at the chair where Washington is sitting. And don't forget, he presided over the Constitutional Convention. He only said two things during the debates in the room in Philadelphia, but he presided and gavelled the day to order each day and gavelled it to an end in the evening. And Franklin looked at him and said, I know that the first man we make president will be a good one. And he pointed at Washington. But what comes afterward, I cannot be certain. So it was their faith in Washington, because Washington had already proven that he was not power hungry, that he respected the norms that had been set down among these men for political, for honor and decency in their political discourse and interaction. They recognized who Washington was, and they knew that when he had been asked in 1783 by his own military, to his soldiers, his officers who were so furious at the way that Congress was performing, failing to pay them, et cetera, Washington resisted all blandishments to make himself a king, and he gave up power at the end of the revolution, which no general before or since has ever done. Think of every revolution and coup that has occurred since then. None of them has ended with the man in power handing over power to a properly constituted civil government. But Washington had done that at the end of the revolution. Then they had seen how across a span of 7 or 8 years that the system wasn't working. They hadn't created a strong enough legal document to bind the 13 colonies. And that's basically what the Constitution is a legal document. So they said, let's all get together again. And they created the new government and the Constitution. And they determined that there could only be one president, and that was George Washington, because he had been the one who'd held the army together through the Revolution, and then he'd given it up. And as King George had said when Washington handed in his sword to Congress and rode home to Mount Vernon to his private life in 1783, if Washington can do this, he'll be the greatest man in the world. And he did it. And then he did it again at the end of his second term as president. But of course, by then, he had encountered what would become the basic structure of American politics from that day to this, which is a clash of factions. He had hoped that there would be no factions, that everybody would get along. And he was to be sadly mistaken on that score. First of all, there was a conflict from the beginning among the founding fathers as to whether we would be an agricultural or a mercantile economy, mercantile/manufacturing economy. I remember talking with David McCullough once about what his new book was to be. And he said, I'm thinking of writing a book about the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Adams, of course, had the vision of an economy that actually was rather similar to what Hamilton would envision, an economy that revolved around money lending and investment and all the other things that we have today, versus an agricultural economy based upon the work of the yeoman farmer doing his best to support himself and his family. Basically, the challenge between the North and the South, ultimately. And then one day I saw David McCullough again, and I said, so you're still doing that book on Adams and Jefferson? He said, well, I've decided that it's only going to be about Adams, because Adams was right and Jefferson was wrong. America would not be built upon the backs of the yeoman farmers, but upon the business of credit and banking and manufacturing and all of those other things that from the beginning in the 18th century, the Northern interests saw as the direction toward actual wealth. And I think it's the same in the Civil War as well. First of all, the North is far more technologically advanced than the South. Much larger population, of course, much greater ability to produce weaponry. And throughout the Civil War, the Northern generals and Lincoln make far greater use of the high tech of the time, the telegraph and the railroad, than the Southerners do. It's one of the reasons that the North is able ultimately to win. And so, North is business and investment, the South is agriculture, and so the North is victorious and eradicates slavery. To fold in the questions of race into this debate, which has pretty much been won at this point, I'm not sure that that I can really find a wedge into it. I mean, racism is its own creature. It has existed not just in the United States, where, of course, we have had to deal with it and continue to deal with it again and again, but it has existed across the world, around the world. It's just, remember how this conversation began some time ago. It's one of those aspects of human nature that never changes. And we're always trying to change it. And we do our best to change it. And one of the things that I try to get across to you when you read one of my novels is that this country, and all of these books are set in the United States, this country ain't perfect. It never has been. The flaws are there for all to see. And yet there is always a glimmer of hope that this might be the place where we can overcome the flaws of humanity, where we can create what John Winthrop on the deck of the Arbella, the Puritan ship that first dropped anchor in Boston Harbor in 1630, when the Puritans arrived 10 years after the Pilgrims, and they looked up at the hillside that became Beacon Hill. And Winthrop, in his first sermon on the deck of the ship, said that we must make of this a godly place, a city upon a hill. And that idea, that vision, has continued throughout American history. And while I might try to show you the slavery, the darkness of slavery, the horrors of the Civil War, and all of the other bad things of American history that we must confront in order to be good Americans, I also try to show you that vision and that value, which was echoed 400 years later by Ronald Reagan, and which has been echoed again and again throughout our history. And that's really the best answer I can give when you're asking me to fold economy and politics and race all into the same giant ball, which of course it is. But we write novels in order to take the beast apart and then put it back together again. And so the best way to understand what it is that I'm saying and that I'm thinking and dreaming about is to read one of my books. Well, it's our job as Americans to maintain and expand that welcome, and to continue to give people reasons to want to be here and to want to contribute to this society, because that's what has made us great. And I think Washington understood that too. He himself was a product of lots of help from lots of people who weren't born here, whether we're talking about Alexander Hamilton or Lafayette or von Steuben or any of those other characters. Washington, I wouldn't exactly call him open-minded, but he was large-minded and big-hearted, I think, and those are those are qualities that we like to think Americans always have.
William Martin is a very creative storyteller. He skillfully uses historical facts and characters to add excitement and anticipation to his stories. His fictions transport readers into the past and allow them to live in it and visualize it. His books are individual, thrilling journeys into different parts of America's history. Be sure to read one of his books.